My name is Kate Seeley. I'm the Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute, and I would like to welcome you to our second panel of the day, debating Turkish foreign policy in a changing global and regional system, sponsored by the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs Strategic Research Center. And to them we owe our lunch, so I want to thank them for filling us all up. So thanks for the lovely lunch. I just want to say, by way of introduction, that prior to the Arab uprisings of 2011, there was much for Turkey to be proud of with regards to its very successful regional foreign policy. Under the rubric of, quote, zero problems with neighbors, the AKP government established economic and political alliances in the Middle East, took part in regional initiatives, and sought to play an active role in the resolution of regional conflicts. Policymakers singled out economic interdependence as an important tool, allowing Turkey to gain depth in its neighborhood and strengthen its relations with other Middle Eastern countries. But as popular movements started toppling authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, Turkish policymakers faced major trade-offs between securing Turkey's interests and supporting the democratic demands of the uprisings. In response, Turkey has had to recalibrate its foreign policy, and nowhere else has that been more of a challenge than with regard to its Syria policy, which we've been discussing quite a bit today. So these questions, the questions of the reshaping of Turkish policy in reaction to regional dynamics, is at the heart of today's discussion. And we are joined by three excellent panelists from Turkey to address this topic. Bülent Aras will be looking at Turkish-EU relations in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Mesut Özcan will examine Turkey's general policy towards the Middle East and North Africa after the Arab Spring. And Şaban Kardaş will explore Turkey's power dynamics in reaction to the new regional challenges. Let me introduce them briefly in order in which they'll be speaking. Their longer bios are in the program books. Bülent Aras has taught at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences of Istanbul Technical University before he was appointed as chairman of the Foreign Ministry Strategic Research Center, SAM. He's also written many books. Şaban Kardaş is an associate professor of international relations in the Department of International Relations at TOBB University of Economics and Technology in Ankara. Dr. Kardaş also works as an advisor at the Diplomacy Academy. He's published scholarly articles and book chapters on Turkish domestic and foreign policy. And last but not least, Dr. Mesut Özcan joined the Foreign Ministry's Strategic Research Center as deputy chairman in September 2011. He's also an advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and is the author of several books, including Harmonizing Foreign Policy, Turkey, the EU, and the Middle East. And now I would like to welcome Mr. Aras to the podium.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'll be the only one talking on EU, at least bringing some EU dimension to this conference. Actually, I don't blame the conference organizers for this. Maybe we should look at the own dynamics of the relations being so far away from Turkey-related conferences. Here, what I will try to do is to connect one processes to two actors. The ongoing processes is Arab Spring, and there has been too much discussion so far. And the other two actors, I'll try to connect it, Turkey and the EU. And what I have in mind is that Arab Spring is a very radical transformation in Middle East and North Africa, and this transformation poses challenges as well as opportunities to the actors around it. And Turkey and EU are two important actors in just very close to what's going on, known as the Arab Spring. While Turkey and EU have its own interaction and the dynamics, which is very much deadlock in these days. But I see, a chance for a renewed partnership, renewed relationship between Turkey and EU, taking, a good consideration of what's going on in the Arab Spring geography. While referring a dynamic change in the Arab Spring geography, we should also, say that the EU is facing a severe crisis and in a process of redefining its political role in the region and in global terms. Turkey is also under a transformation. Well, these two actors and the processes, they all represent, a good deal of dynamism. What's happening in the EU is obvious to tackle with economic crisis, and that economic crisis will also have an influence on the future of EU itself and its role in the neighborhood and in broader terms. And Turkey is under a transformation. Turkey domestically deals with its own domestic deficit. The priority is Kurdish peace processes, but the recent protests in Taksim also brought the need for further democratic consolidation at home. How to make sense of Turkey-EU relations in these three dynamic processes, one region and two dynamic actors next to it? Well, first of all, maybe we should start with trying to understand the dynamics between Turkey and EU. Well, Turkish foreign policy has, a good deal of discontinuity with the past. Everyone is talking about, Turkish foreign policy activism. And this Turkish foreign policy activism largely relies on a multi-regional framework. Turkey opened up, Turkey refocused its geographic orientation, and now you see Turkey not only in its neighborhood but in Africa, Latin America, Asia. There has been so many talks on Turkey and Syria. Turkey's foreign policy does not only consist of its Syria policy. Turkey is expanding in Africa, opening up embassies in Latin America, Asia. This, new orientation is kind of a work in progress and continuous. Well, at the center of this Turkey's new strategic thinking or new foreign policy identity, I think, there is this European dimension. It is a multi-regional identity with a primary focus of European identity. There is a deadlock between Turkey and EU, but however, there is no doubt in terms of, in Turkey's Europeanness. Turkish-European relations are, much older than EU itself. And, this long period of interaction had two legacies in Turkish foreign policy. One is simply Turkey or the Ottoman Empire has been always in a position to reconcile the relations with Europe and the relations in its hinterland, and that legacy continues. And the second is Turkish policymakers always felt to adapt domestic situation to what's happening in Europe. For example, just two examples comes to my mind. When there was this Congress of Vienna, once upon a time in earlier centuries in Europe, there was Tanzimat, imperial edict reforms in Turkey to restructure domestic political arena according to what's happening in Europe. And now Turkey's, democratization, desecuritization is also a reflection of EU membership process. This is the other legacy that is very much in Turkish domestic politics, foreign policy nexus, as well as Turkey's foreign policy behavior. What I'm trying to say, there is a Europe in the genesis of Turkish foreign policy. How you discover what is in the genesis of a foreign policy? It occurs through the times of what Ambassador Bozkır referred is during the times of political earthquakes. And the recent earthquakes are like, the end of Cold War, the September 11, and this Arab Spring. These are major political earthquakes. And when you looked at the Turkish responses vis-a-vis these developments, Turkish policy responses guided by its European Western identity. And just to come to the response to Arab Spring, when you looked at the Turkish response to Arab Spring, it is sided with the West, with the Europe, not with the other members of global South. That's why when you listen to Ambassador Bozkır, you recognize the disappointment with Russia. There is also this same disappointment with India, China, those, the rising global south. Turkey's position is more close to West and Europe in that sense. Well, what's happening in Arab Spring, what I like to say, what brought people to street? It is, I think, very important. And it's not, the notions of, Islamic thinkers or the leftist socialist revolutionaries. Well, the demands are very simple. They want to catch up with the rest of the world. The demands are, universal norms of good governance. And here, it is, very difficult to say there has been a Turkish or European impact on the emergence of Arab Spring. But what happened, happened. But what happened offers an opportunity, both Turkey and the EU. What EU tries to do in the past 4 decades, 2 to 3 decades, is the emergence of a political community based on associate itself to this universal norm of good governance, democracy, human rights, search for these kind of things. And this is what happened. And it happened without, a major EU impact. And I think, there comes this possible opportunity of Turkey and EU vis-a-vis the Arab Spring. And people, these demands took people to street. But what's going to be formed, we'll see in the course of time. But Turkey and EU has a chance to have a positive impact to the course of the developments in the direction of, appropriating these norms into policymaking and further state-making enterprises. So why EU should cooperate with Turkey? Turkey has, assets and access to the new actors. And Turkey is already, doing well with Tunisia, with Egypt, with Libya, and good relations with the other countries which are, under this transformation, like Algeria, Jordan, Bahrain, and others. And, a collaboration with Turkey provides, access to these geographies and increases EU's capabilities to deal with this geography. Now, I think it's a chance to observe the emergence of this new political community under the premise of this complete change of landscape in this geography. Turkey, EU, a sort of strategic partnership vis-a-vis Arab Spring will also, consolidate the emerging new collective consciousness. Yesterday, we at the similar panel at Wilson Center, and I referred to, that came to my mind during the presentation, the former, the Arabic philosopher Ibn Khaldun. And he has a notion of this asabiya, collective consciousness. And, interestingly, he lived in the same geography that in these days Arab Spring occurred, Tunisia, Egypt, and those territories. Now, like Ibn Khaldun's notions of asabiya, a new collective consciousness is emerging. And this new collective consciousness associates itself with these universal norms and values of government, search for good governance, human rights, dignity, and other issues. Now, Turkish-EU cooperation will certainly, help this new solidarity, even with a chance of, to have a real meaning of European political geography. A new political community Europe is yearning for so long time, but it has failed to achieve through Eastern Partnership, Mediterranean dialogue, etc. And Turkish-EU cooperation towards democratic consolidation, state-making processes, security of transformation in these countries, would also likely to have a positive effect on Turkey's own transformation. Turkish-EU cooperation on democratic consolidation in these geographies will also be a motivating factor for Turkey's own democratic consolidation. And yesterday there was an EU Parliament resolution on Turkey. And if the EU is sincere in its call for further democratization in Turkey and fine-tuning in its what already achieved, this kind of cooperation will also, likely to have an impact on Turkey's own transformation. And lastly, this kind of cooperation from Turkey's new strategic thinking will also make EU a more capable actor. What EU foreign policy is, if you ask me to define it, it's an ineffective rhetorical multilateralism. But now a regional dynamism in foreign policy is likely to make EU more influential in terms of this newly emerging multilateralism, and it's going to positively contribute to the nature and the ethical framework of the new multilateralism. I have just 8 minutes, and this is what I can do. Thank you very much.
It seems I also have 8 minutes, but it took longer than 8 minutes, so I will follow the same path. In my presentation, I will try to respond to the main theme of the panel. I will try to share with you my own take on where Turkey positions itself vis-à-vis the transformations in the regional and global order. So actually it is part of a paper I am currently working on. I am trying to propose that Turkey can be understood as a regional power in order to study the recent activism in Turkish foreign policy, which was also referred to by Professor Aras. There are several concepts around. Some people tend to use different concepts such as neo-Ottomanism, such as other concepts which are in circulation include inter-regional superpower, regional power with global extension, a regional power that is on the way to become a global power. I argue that those concepts are leading to some confusion. If we use the old concept of regional power, we could easily make sense of the recent activism in Turkish foreign policy. In scholarly analysis on Turkish foreign policy, especially in American think tank community as well, that concept has been around for the last 20 years or so, especially with the end of the Cold War. In the early post-Cold War years, there were attempts to define and describe Turkey as a regional power, but with the activism under AK Party era, again, that concept came up. But at the same time, in the literature on regional powers, which is becoming more and more visible in international relations studies, especially in the last 5 years, there is a growing interest in regional powers in different parts of the world. Sometimes they are also referred to as rising powers, BRICS, so on and so forth. Now, there are analytical efforts to properly define regional powers, develop different theoretical frameworks to study their foreign policy behavior. So in my own presentation, in my own research, what I am trying to do is similar, try to propose an analytical framework, a theoretical framework to explain Turkish foreign policy in the last 2 or 3 decades. So that concept is useful to understand both the continuities and the transformations and changes in Turkish foreign policy, because especially there is also an interest in the Turkish foreign policy under AK Party. Some people, some scholars suggest that under AK Party, Turkish foreign policy broke with the old tradition. It has adopted a new foreign policy behavior. Others challenge that argument. Others rather try to highlight the continuities in Turkish foreign policy, even under AK Party. So by using the concept of regional power, I think we can also try to understand both the continuities and the changes in Turkish foreign policy under the last 10 years during the AK Party governments. I partly agree with Professor Aras's characterization of the changes in Turkish foreign policy under AK Party. The reflexes of a regional power have been there even before the AK Party came to power in the early post-Cold War era. The Turkish leaders at the time before the AK Party, they were also trying to assert Turkey as a regional power. So in that sense, there is strong similarity and continuity. But there are also some differences in the way Turkey's foreign policy has been conducted lately under AK Party. At least we can identify several differences. In my eyes, one of those differences is that in addition to the activism, foreign policy activism at the regional level, in the last 10 years, especially in the last 5-6 years, we see that Turkey is also becoming active at the global level. In addition to becoming an influential actor at the regional politics, Turkey has been trying to assert itself in global affairs as well. So this is the main difference from the Turkey of the 1990s. When we talk about the global level of activism in Turkish foreign policy, we can look at different dimensions. For instance, in the last couple of years, Turkey has been trying to reach out to new regions. So in Turkish, we call it openings to Africa, Latin America, Asia. This is part of the global level activism in Turkish foreign policy. At the same time, there is a second dimension to it, which is where Turkey is trying to gain visibility in the advocacy of some global issues. For instance, Turkey hosted the LDC, Least Developed Countries Conference in 2011. Now, Turkey is making a big argument about the issue of underdevelopment. Again, Turkey is also making big issues about global justice, trying to defend the rights of the Palestinians. So this visibility in the support for global issues is another dimension of the global activism in the last 10 years. There's another dimension, which is where Turkey is criticizing the existing international institutions, especially the UN Security Council. When we look at the statements of Turkish leaders, especially the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, as well as the President, we see that they are questioning the structure of the international institutions. They are calling for revision to those institutions. This is also something new for Turkish foreign policy. That's why we have to look at both the dimensions of Turkish regional activism, but also the different dimensions of Turkey's global level activism. There is also another difference in Turkish foreign policy in the last 10 years compared to 20 years ago, compared to the 1990s. It is the growing emphasis Turkey puts on cultural arguments, especially civilizational dimension. So in that sense, here we could refer to the Foreign Minister Davutoğlu's understanding of civilization. Turkey is belonging in a wider civilization, the way he positions Turkey in international affairs based on civilizational arguments. So in my own ongoing research, I am trying to develop an analytical framework so that we can capture Turkey's activism not only at its own region, but also at the regions beyond its own reach at the global level. So I have been suggesting that in order to understand Turkish foreign policy activism, we have to keep in mind a couple of basic points. The first one, which was also mentioned by Professor Aras, is that Turkey is a multi-regional power. So Turkey is not part of one single region. Turkey, by virtue of its location, simultaneously is part of different regions, including the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Black Sea, and the Middle East. So in order to develop a framework to understand Turkey's behavior, we have to keep that dimension in mind. There is another major dimension, which is where Turkey is sitting at the nexus of the regional and global systems. Actually, this is one of the major characteristics of different regional powers. So by its position at the nexus of the regional and global systems, Turkey has to perform different roles. Inside the region, Turkey performs different roles, but because it is mediating between the regional and the global order, it also has to be active at the global level, but it also has to be part of the global level calculations. So in my own analytical framework, I am trying to look at how Turkey conducts itself in the region, but also at the same time in global affairs. When we look at the position of Turkey in global affairs, the first question that we have to answer is whether Turkey is a country that is revisionist or Turkey is more or less a country that is pro-status quo. I mean, that's a major debate, especially in the United States among different think tanks. I see different reports coming out that are trying to understand the future of the American power, how the United States will conduct its relations with different rising powers, because it is important. If different rising powers are revisionist, meaning if they question the American-led, US-led liberal international order, we might have a different world in 10 years' time. But if they buy into the existing order, if they decide to operate within that international order established by the United States, then we have a different world. So in that sense, the main question which we may discuss is where Turkey stands on this divide, whether Turkey is a revisionist country or whether Turkey is a country that is questioning, that is challenging the existing US-led international order. In my own argumentation, in my own research, I have been arguing that although in some issues Turkey has been highly critical of the international order, especially about justice, overall Turkey has been a pro-status quo power. So Turkey is comfortable living in the US-led international order, as Professor Aras also suggested. The case of the Arab uprisings, the Arab Spring, Turkey's position on Syria has demonstrated that Turkey overall conducts its foreign policy based on a Western liberal notion. So the other dimension of Turkish foreign policy is what Turkey does in the regions, in addition to what it does at the global level. But to understand what Turkey does in its own neighborhoods, in different regions, we can also look at different variables. Here I more or less suggested we have to look at what I call the regional order. Because in different regions, we have different regional orders. For instance, in the Middle East, we have a different regional order. In the Balkans, we have a different type of regional order. In the Eurasia, we have a different regional order. So Turkey's behavior also reflects those differences. For instance, in the Middle East, we have a multipolar order. There are different regional powers. There is Iran, there is Saudi Arabia, there is Egypt, there is Israel. So in such an order, Turkey's behavior is different. But in the Balkans, Turkey is really a big country. There is no country that can match Turkey's size in terms of power. So in the Balkans, Turkey behaves in a different way. But still, despite those differences, in different regions, Turkey pursues similar policies in the sense that Turkey has been trying to create greater level of, greater degree of regional cooperation. So in this sense, Turkey has been trying to promote regionalization, institution building at the regional level in the last couple of years. So the instruments Turkey used have been several. For instance, high-level strategic cooperation councils. It has been one of the main instruments. This is meant to develop strategic political cooperation among regional countries. Another instrument Turkey was used, it was economic integration. Turkey has been trying to create free trade areas and so on and so forth. But there is also another dimension which I will briefly mention and stop here. It is the role perceptions of Turkey, how Turkey perceives its role in different regions. So again, in the literature, we talk about several roles states ascribe to themselves. But in my own research, I am identifying 3 different roles. The first one is what I call management role. The second one is the leadership role. And the third one is the representation role. Management means a country such as Turkey tries to ensure that the existing regional norms are applied, the existing regional norms are maintained and observed. The second role, leadership role, means that a country tries to establish new institutions, tries to also establish new norms in the region. So it takes leadership in this process. The representation roles, they mean that a country tries to represent its own region at the international platforms. For instance, Turkey defending the rights of the Palestinians in international platforms at the UN, or Turkey's position inside NATO can also be understood from the same perspective. For instance, in terms of discussing NATO's involvement in Afghanistan, Turkey was trying to convey the sensitivities of its own region to NATO platforms. So in my own research, I am trying to develop this framework so that we can make sense of the activism both at the regional and global levels within a single analytical framework.
Please, Mr. Özcan.
being the last speaker before the speech of the Deputy Prime Minister, I will stick to my time. Okay. I will talk about how Turkish foreign policy makers perceive the changes in the Middle East, how do they respond to these developments in the region. And most of the time, we can say that they argued the change in the Middle East is a natural one. Actually, it's a delayed one because most of the time the policymakers in Turkey evaluate the developments taking place in the Middle East in a comparison with the developments in Eastern Europe in the 1990s. And many of the policymakers argue that the change should come earlier to the region because although we had this, after the end of Cold War, we had this transition in Eastern Europe, but the transition in the Middle East actually happened 20 years later. And for this reason, they believe that the demands of the people are genuine demands, so they were asking for more freedom, democracy, good governance, but at the same time they were asking better services, end of corruption, etc. So they perceived and understood the developments within such a framework, and they try to develop their policy accordingly. And before the developments of Arab Spring, Turkey was trying to have good relations with the neighboring regions, tried to increase its economic, political, and cultural relations with the countries in the region. And the changes during this period of time, before the changes, Turkey also had its own transformation. Turkey was also transforming its own economy, its own political structure. Turkey is a candidate to the European Union. So as a result of this EU agenda, Turkey was also transforming its own political structure. But at the same time, when it's having own transformation, Turkish policymakers were also arguing the same kind of transformation in the region. The policymakers, the current president or the foreign minister or the prime minister, when they were having contacts with their counterparts in the Middle East, they were also asking a kind of evolutionary change in the region. They were also asking some kind of reforms from the inside, not from the outside. But with the Arab Spring, the developments came not in an evolutionary way, but by a revolutionary way. So Turkey also has to adapt its policy accordingly to these changes. As I said before the Arab Spring, Turkey was trying to have good relations, developing economic, cultural, and political relations. As it is mentioned by previous speakers, Turkey was having high-level political dialogue, Turkey having high-level visits, establishing some kind of mechanisms to develop good political relations, but at the same time, Turkey was having some good economic relations. Turkey signed several free trade agreements with the countries in the Middle East. And at the same time, Turkey also supported its business people to have businesses in the Middle East. And the share of Middle Eastern countries in Turkish foreign trade increased in a decade by more than 10%. So these political and economic relations contributed to Turkish economy in the last decade because although we had this global financial crisis, the effect of this financial and economic crisis on Turkey was less if we compare it with other countries. And thanks to its increasing economic and political relations with the Middle East, Turkey could escape some of the negative outcomes of this financial and economic crisis. And with this Arab Spring, when these developments took place, then Turkey has to adapt its policy. And when we look to the special cases, Turkish policy towards Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, or Yemen, they were very much similar, although there are also some differences. In general terms, Turkey sided with the change. Turkish policymakers said that if there is a demand for the change, then we will support this change. And they sided with the revolutionary forces. But at the same time, they have to adapt their policies according to each cases, because the case of Egypt was different from the case of Tunisia. It was different from the case of Libya. And in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, it was easy for Turkey because although Turkey also developed good political and economic relations with the former regimes there, the new regimes after the Arab Spring were much more friendly in terms of having good political relations with Turkey. In the case of Libya, although Turkey had in the beginning some difficulties because of the Turkish presence, more than 25,000 people working there. At the same time, there were some Turkish investments. First, Turkey tried to secure these people, then adapted its policy accordingly. And in the case of Yemen, it was an easy transition because there was a negotiated settlement there. And after these developments, Turkey tried to contribute to the transition there. First, by some political means. Turkey established good political dialogue with the new regimes there. There were some bilateral visits. And also Turkey established this high-level political dialogue mechanisms with Egypt. And this was also the case with Tunisia and with Libya as well. And in terms of economic relationships, Turkey also tried to contribute to the transition by economic means. Turkey provided credits to Egypt, to Tunisia, to Libya during the transition period in order to contribute to transition there. Because if there wouldn't be an economic contribution from other actors like Turkey or from any other regional and global actor, then because of the turmoil, political turmoil, then we will have the difficulties there. Because one of the reasons of this Arab Spring was also related with economic difficulties after the economic crisis all over the world. So in order to have a smooth transition here, any other actor should contribute to this transition. In that respect, Turkey provided credits to these countries with its own capacity. At the same time, Turkey also provided some expertise, some technical assistance to these countries in terms of political developments, for example, in constitution writing, election laws, etc. At the same time, the people, diplomats, professionals, journalists were taken, they were invited to Turkey. There were some education programs for these people, and also in Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In Diplomatic Academy, Turkey is also providing some kind of education for the young diplomats coming from these countries. Turkey was trying to contribute to the transition here. But besides economic and political contribution, Turkey also tried to have some kind of technical contribution. For example, in order to have services, basic services in these countries, Turkey was also providing some equipments to these countries just to help them, the municipalities or local governments, to contribute to have a better environment in these countries. And the most difficult case for Turkey was Syria, and this was discussed in the morning. And Turkey also has to adapt its policy towards Syria, because in the last decade, Syria was the biggest investment of Turkey. Given the negative memories of 1980s and 1990s, Turkey had some problematic relations with Syria. In order to avoid a similar scenario in 2000s, Turkey developed good political and economic relations with Syria. But when the Arab Spring also arrived to Syria, Turkey first tried to convince the Syrian regime to have a reform agenda. But Turkey couldn't convince them, and they opted for a confrontation, for a policy of repression. Then Turkey has to make a choice, and Turkey also sided, along with other cases, Turkey sided with the demands of the change. So Turkey adapted its policy accordingly. And currently, Turkey is supporting the opposition movement, and one of the reasons was, this is in principle, this is in line with in general policy of Turkey, but at the same time, Turkey also invested a lot in this country, and the problems in Syria is creating serious economic and political and also security issues for Turkey, security problems for Turkey. And now Turkey is trying to overcome these difficulties with its own capacity, but at the same time with the contribution of regional and international actors. And when the conflict in Syria broke out, Turkey tried to help the transition with its own capacity. Then Turkey tried to contribute to the regional efforts of Arab League or Islamic Cooperation Organization, then also along with the United Nations, with other international actors. So Turkey opted for a gradual change here, but unfortunately the developments get out of control, and now we have this crisis, and lately we also had this news about the use of chemical weapons, and we will see how the developments will take place afterwards. To sum up, in general, the change in the region was an expected change, but no one expected that come so early, because, as I said, Turkey was expecting an evolutionary change. Turkey was trying to have an evolutionary change, but when this revolutionary change arrived, then Turkey also adapted its policy accordingly. In the countries of transition, it is easy for Turkey to have dialogue with the new actors, but in countries like Syria, then there is the problem for Turkey, and Turkey is trying to overcome these problems. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank our three panelists. Thank our three panelists for their insights into Turkey's foreign policy. I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions from the microphones on the side. Because we had very little time for questions before, I'd like to just go directly to our floor. And if you could please identify yourself and ask your question. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Both sides or just...
My name is
We'll go
Mindy.
back and forth. What I'll do is I'll take probably 3 questions and then distribute them to the panel.
Okay,
so
fine.
We'll go back and forth.
Hi, my name is Mindy Reiser. I'm vice president of an American NGO called Global Peace Services USA. I'm curious to see what your thinking is about Turkey's accession to the EU at this point. I need not emphasize that these negotiations have been going on for a long time now. And at this point in 2013, where do you think they will end?
Okay, so one question next, please.
Yes, my name is Revu Bayravic, and I work for an NGO here in Washington called Emerging Democracies Institute. And my question is related to Turkey's policy in the Balkans, and more specifically to the issue of the election of the former Serbian Foreign Minister Vuk Jeremić to the chairmanship of the UN General Assembly. It was fairly surprising to see that Turkey was ended up siding with Jeremić's candidacy, and as a result, he was elected last year. And in the last almost 9 months since he's been elected, there were a few things that the people in the Balkans didn't really appreciate from Jeremić, because, as you know, he is a fairly right-wing politician with some controversial views, especially about the Hague Tribunal and so on. So my question to you is, having in mind what Turkey's position in the Balkans is, the proximity to Bosnia, Albania, and all the other former Ottoman states, what was the calculus behind the decision to support Jeremić's candidacy? Was it the Palestinian question, the vote on the Palestinian statehood that was supposed to come after he was elected, or was it something else? Because it was a decision that kind of stood out from the pattern that Turkey tried to project in the Balkans of proximity to these former Balkan Ottoman states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's take our last question over here, please. If you could.
Hello.
Yep.
My name is Bilal. I'm an international student at Brandeis International Business School and a research associate at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. I have an open question. What are some of the key reasons why Turkey has still not been included into the EU? And how would you evaluate Prime Minister Erdogan's shift away from the West towards the Middle East and the East? Thank you.
Okay. Why don't we, would you like to take the Turkey-EU questions, maybe Şaban, the Turkey-Balkans question, and then you can take Turkey-Erdogan Middle East questions. So shall we begin with Bülent?
Okay, where's Turkey-EU relations is going? Well, it's not going anywhere. It stopped. But there is some hope. You know, there is a new French attitude. The new French attitude may, you know, a little bit push Germans to take some position. But, you know, the perspective of Turkish foreign policymakers is to follow a low-profile policy, and then, you know, to wait for Europeans to make up their mind. We did not give up our, you know, search for being an EU member, and we are doing what we can do to fulfill the criteria. Turkey, you know, have a variety of, you know, different policies, but these are not simply the, you know, does not represent a shift from EU policy. Turkey's, you know, this main axis of foreign policy is the EU and the transatlantic relations, with a widened agenda to the geographies we referred.
Thank you. Şaban?
About the Balkans?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, actually Serbia has also was a part of the Ottoman Empire, so the Turkish policy toward the Balkans, one dimension is the common history. So with the Serbs as well, the Turks had a common history, so Turkey is not interested in presenting its policy as based on the Muslim elements of the Ottoman Empire. So with all elements of the Ottoman Empire era Balkans, Turkey has been trying to develop good relations, but because of the negative legacy of the dissolution of the Yugoslavia, you know the Turkish position there. So there was created an impression that Turkey is siding only with certain Muslim and Turkish elements there. Over time, especially in the last couple of years, 5 years or so, Turkey has been trying to correct that image. So in that sense, Turkey is now reopening toward the Balkans by also embracing Serbia. So Turkey has been, for instance, instrumental in the normalization between Serbia and Bosnia. Turkey has been holding several high-level summits, including the Turkish president, Bosnian and Serbian president, including in a separate platform, another trilateral forum involved Turkish president, Bosnian president, and the Croatian president. So Turkey is trying to conduct this Balkan policy based on, again, the same principle of multidimensionality because it doesn't want to act only based on certain cultural elements. And when we talk about, again, the Ottoman past, it also applies to the Greeks, to Bulgarians, Serbs, all other nations of the Balkans. So it's a common shared heritage.
Thank you. Mesut?
About the question about Erdogan. Turkey not only developed its relation with Asia but also Africa, Middle East as well. During that period of time, when Turkey tried to develop good relations with the neighboring countries, there were the arguments about shift of axis. But Turkey was trying to develop good relations with neighboring countries, but also to reach areas which were neglected in the past. For example, in Africa, in Latin America, in East Asia. Now, in the last decade, there is a transition in terms of economic transition, for example. So Turkish business people are looking for opportunities in different parts of the world. So Turkey is also trying to develop good relations with these new regions. This doesn't mean that Turkey is abandoning Western identity or Western vacation. During that period of time, Turkey also, as a candidate to the European Union, introduced some reforms. Turkey started negotiations with the EU, although there are some difficulties here. But what Turkey was trying to do during this period of time, to develop good relations, not only with Western countries, but also with Middle East, Central Asia, East Asia, and also Africa.
Great. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw this panel to a close a little earlier than we'd expected because the Deputy Prime Minister is here, and we're going to be going directly from this panel into the keynote.